Hello, Ted Morrissey here doing a video for my American Literature seminar. And we've recently read from our anthology, Donald Barthelme's The School. And it's so different from what we've read previously in our seminar course that I thought it'd be worth taking a few minutes to kind of talk about in what way is it different and what does it represent. All right. So up to this point, we've read Tony's Story by Silko. We've read Communist, another short story anthology. And they are both examples of realistic fiction. In both stories, even though they're very different in terms of setting, in terms of the characters, I mean, they do have some similarities in that way too. They both feature, kind of teenage protagonists, and obviously they're both coming of age, loss of innocence stories, which is the theme of our seminar. But they operate in the same way. They're realistic. They happen in real places. They have things happen in terms of the way things really happen in life, whether it's fights between police and people they're harassing, or whether it's going, goose hunting, or whatever it might be. The writers represent the world in realistic ways. Barthelme, in The School, isn't doing that. This is an example of what's called absurdist fiction. Absurd, of course, is a word we might have as part of our kind of everyday working vocabulary. We talk about a situation being absurd, or talk about someone's criticism of us being absurd. It just doesn't make any sense. It's not based on any kind of real information, real data. And that's obviously the way absurd works in this context as well. So in Barthelme's story, it's a short story, just like the other examples we looked at were short stories. It has characters, it has plot, it has resolution of sorts, and all those elements, but yet it doesn't operate in a realistic way. Absurdist fiction sort of came to the forefront in the latter half of the 20th century, sort of after the atom bomb, perhaps, which ushered in the first time in human history when we could literally destroy the world with the touch of a couple of buttons. And it just sort of resulted in this idea of just the absurdity of it all, the absurdity of life, the absurdity of living, the absurdity of the fact that we could destroy the world with our own invention. We've invented something now that we can use to destroy ourselves with as a species. That's pretty absurd, right? And so a lot of artists, a lot of writers reacted to that absurdity by creating their own kind of brand of absurdist theater, absurdist films, and absurdist fiction. Now, Barthelme was known for this sort of thing. Other writers maybe have some examples of absurdist work in their body of work, but otherwise might be working more realistically much of the time. Whereas some writers were known for their absurdist works. You probably have encountered some of them before. Franz Kafka, whose short story The Metamorphosis is highly anthologized. A lot of times we read that in high school and undergraduate courses. The Metamorphosis is about Gregor Samsa, who wakes up one morning to discover that he's turned into a giant insect overnight. And so the rest of the story is about Gregor being a big beetle or some sort of insect. Different translators kind of disagree on what kind of bug he was supposed to be. But, he has all these problems now because it's hard being a human-sized bug, right? Relating to his family and his employer and just the world around him. It's absurd, right? Kurt Vonnegut, very well-known absurdist writer, books like Slaughterhouse 5, Breakfast of Champions, on and on and on. His work has sort of an absurdist tinge to it, It's more realistic in some ways than some other absurdist writers, but Slaughterhouse-Five you may be familiar with. On the one hand, it is a realistic narrative, a memoir where Vonnegut is recounting his experiences during World War II as a prisoner of war. And then mixed in with that is this science fiction novel where Billy Pilgrim is abducted by aliens and transported to this zoo on an alien planet. And so it's absurd in the sense that we kind of ping pong back and forth between these two storylines, and yet they are somehow connected, right? So Barthelme, as I say, was very well known as an absurdist writer. I'll just kind of read you the little blurb. I know you probably looked at it yourself, but Barthelme, at 1931 to 1989, published 12 books, including 2 novels and a prize-winning children's book. A regular contributor to the New Yorker. That's kind of an understatement. He published hundreds of stories in the New Yorker. He divided his time between New York and Houston, where he taught creative writing at the University of Houston. In his career, he won a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Book Award, and a National Institute of Arts and Letters Award, among other honors. He passed away in July 1989. Yeah, Barthelme's publishing in the New Yorker was kind of absurd in itself because the New Yorker really wasn't known to like that style, his style of fiction, but for whatever reason, they really got a taste for his writing, and like I said, they published hundreds of his short stories over his career. It says in a little blurb here that he only published 2 novels. Now, those were actually pretty short themselves. His short stories tend to be very short, like this short story at the school. His novels were very short novels, and in fact, his first novel, Snow White, was so short, the New Yorker published it in its entirety in one of its issues. And it was not a particularly fat issue. It just basically published that and pretty much nothing else. Normally, the New Yorker, as you may be familiar, has fiction, but it also has essays, it has reviews, cartoons, those kinds of things. In the issue in which they published Snow White, it was essentially just Barthelme's little novel. Okay? But the school, as you know, because you've read it, is very typical in terms of absurdism. Absurd stories tend to have kind of unconventional storytelling techniques. And here we have a school teacher who is our narrator, and he's talking about his experience with the school children, presumably, who, as you know, every animal that they have in class dies on them. Everything they touch seems to die. Then there's a string of deaths among the parents and then among the students themselves. And it just goes on and on and on like that. It gets to the point where it is funny, if you have that sort of sense of humor. And it's a kind of dark humor. So if you like dark humor, kind of gallows humor, sometimes it's called, then you might appreciate the humor in this story with everything dying kind of right and left. But it's also kind of non-conventional, though, because the students are characters, but yet he tends to think of them as they speak in sort of a we, there's like a communal character, and all the students kind of operate in a single voice. And then towards the end of the story, even though they are these school children, they start asking these highly philosophical questions about life and death and so forth. And they said, "Is death that which gives meaning to life?" And I said, "No, life is that which gives meaning to life." Then they said, "But isn't death considered as a fundamental datum, the means by which the taken for granted mundanity of the everyday may be transcended in the direction of?" I said, "Yes, maybe." They said, "We don't like it." I said, "That's sound." They said, "It's a bloody shame." I said, "It is." They said, "Will you make love now with Helen, our teaching assistant, so that we can see how it is done? We know you like Helen." All right, so I'm going to stop there. But obviously, throughout the story up to this point, we've probably been imagining the children in the class as pretty young. I mean, they've got these different kind of animals they're bringing in. They bring in a puppy, and it's sort of the class mascot until it dies about a week later, and things like that. So we're probably imagining them as pretty typical school children. Well, suddenly you launch into all this highly philosophical, adult-sounding, existential kind of discussion, which is completely out of the blue, but it's not out of the blue in the context of this story. The teacher isn't taken aback by it at all and tries to offer some kind of rational response to it, etc. And then we get into this whole business where the children want to watch him have sex with the teaching assistant because that would be a great educational experience for them. And it kind of goes on just a little ways from there. But definitely an absurdist story by one of the great absurdist writers of the 20th century. But again, I wanted to kind of call your attention to it because it's operating so differently as a work of fiction from the other things we've read up to this point, the other short stories. We've also looked at Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, which is very realistic. Later, we're going to read Russell Banks's novel, Rule of the Bone, which has sort of some absurdist elements in it, but by and large, it too is a realistic fiction, right? And we'll talk more about that when we get to it. All right, I'm going to stop there, but maybe you enjoy absurdist work, and if you do, if you liked this story, Barthelme was prolific. Hundreds of stories that he published in his lifetime, and many of them are collected in short story collections. And then there are the two short novels. Like I said, Kurt Vonnegut, who's very, very popular, also known to be an absurdist writer. Joseph Heller, Catch-22, was one of my favorite books when I was in my early 20s. Still very much admire it. That's also a great absurdist work. And there are many more. If you go to the search engine online and look for absurdist fiction, absurdist novels, absurdist authors, you'll get a long list that you can pick from.